Hey my lovely crocheters, I'm Keifa, and today we're turning a simple granny stitch into this cute and stylish bandana halter top. No fancy yarn, no special hooks, just your stash and your enthusiasm. Ready to crochet a top that screams summer? Let's dive right in. As I said, no fancy yarn. You can use any type of yarn that you have and any hook that goes along with it. I'm using this cotton yarn and a 4.5mm hook. You will need your measuring tape because you will need to measure your bust for the top. And you'll need a pair of scissors and your yarn needle for weaving in your ends. You're going to measure around the bust area, and whatever number you get, you're going to take away 5 inches off from it. We begin by making a slip knot. Then we'll make 4 chains. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a slip stitch in the first chain. That will be considered as our magic circle or magic ring. You can make a chain of 5 if the hole is too small. And to begin with our granny stitch pattern, we'll make a chain of 3 and place 2 double crochet in the ring. One, 2 double crochet, and that is our first granny stitch. Then we'll make a chain of 2 and make another granny stitch in the circle. The granny stitch pattern is considered a 3 double crochet pattern, so you're just making 3 double crochet into the ring to form that granny stitch. And there it is, your granny stitch pattern, and this is actually our first row. We are just going to be making granny stitches for the rest of the top. We begin the second row by turning our work and chaining 3, and then we'll make 2 double crochets into that first stitch, which will be our first granny stitch. 1, 2, and then we're gonna make a granny stitch increase into our chain 2 section, which is considered 2 granny stitches. So you'll make your first granny stitch, which is 3 double crochets. 1, 2, and 3 to form your first granny stitch. Then you make a chain of 2 and place another granny stitch in that same chain 2 space. 1 double crochet, 2 double crochet, 3 double crochet, and that is a granny stitch increase. And then for our last granny stitch will be made on the 3rd chain of the last stitch right there. One, 2, 3, and that's the end of row 2. This is really just a repetition of making granny stitches and granny stitch increase in the middle. So let's continue working together until you memorize the pattern. So to begin row 3, turn your work and chain 3 and place 2 double crochet into the first stitch, which is considered the first granny stitch. And now you're gonna place another granny stitch in the next space right there. 1, 2, 3, and then you're gonna make another granny stitch increase in that chain 2 space, and that is something you're going to repeat for every row, making a granny stitch increase in the chain 2 space that you made from the previous row. So you make your first granny stitch of 3 double crochet, chain 2, and make another granny stitch in that same chain 2 space to create a granny stitch increase. And then for the rest of the row, you just continue placing granny stitch in the spaces. And the last granny stitch is always made on the top of the 3rd chain from the previous row. And that's your 3rd row. Let's do the 4th one together. Turn your work and make a chain of 3, and again you're placing your first granny stitch into that first stitch. Because your chain 3 is considered your first double crochet, you're just placing 2 more double crochets in that stitch, and then you're going to place your other granny stitch in all of the available spaces that you see. So this is the first one. Place your first granny stitch in there, your 3 double crochets, and then in the other space you place another granny stitch as well. And then you do the increase in the chain 2 space from the previous row, and the increase is considered of a granny stitch, chain 2, and another granny stitch in the same chain 2 space. Then you'll just continue placing granny stitches in any available spaces. So you'll put one in this space, and then you'll put one in the other space, and your very last one in the 3rd chain from the previous row. So that's your 4th row finished there. And this side is actually the top part of your top. It's where you're going to take the measurement that you had before. You're going to keep working this granny stitch pattern until you reach the size that you took when you measured yourself and took away the 5 inches. So let's keep crocheting. So for the next row, and actually all the previous rows, we're going to start with a chain of 3, which is considered the first double crochet, and make the first granny stitch in the first stitch. And then you're going to place granny stitches into every available space. Like the first one goes here, and then you look for the next space and you place another granny stitch there. And another in the next space. And when you are back at the center of your work where you'll find your chain 2 space, you make another increase granny stitch in there, where you place your first granny stitch of 3 double crochet, then chain 2, and place another granny stitch in the same chain 2 space. Then you'll place your granny stitches in the available spaces on the other side. That space there, another space here. And because of our increases, we have more spaces in every row, so that our top becomes bigger in every row that we make. And then in the last stitch, which is the 3rd chain from the previous row, you make your last granny stitch in there. Okay, so that's 5 rows. One, two, three, 4, 5 rows. Let's go on to the next row. So basically, it is just a continuation of chain 3 and 2 double crochet in the first stitch to form your first granny stitch. Then you will make granny stitches across all your available spaces. And when you reach the middle, which is in the chain 2 space of the increase from the previous row, you will make another granny stitch increase, which considers of a granny stitch, chain 2, and another granny stitch in the same chain 2 space from the previous row. Then you will now continue making granny stitches in all the available spaces again until you reach the last stitch on top of the chain 3 space from the previous row and place your last granny stitch in there. So that's the 6th row, and you're going to keep measuring at the top because you're going to keep crocheting until you reach your desired size that fits your bust. So you will keep making your granny stitch pattern, which consists of your chain 3 and your 2 double crochet in the first stitch and your granny stitch across in every space until you reach the middle, where you will place your granny stitch in crease, which is your granny stitch chain 2 and granny stitch in same space, then your granny stitch across again until your last stitch of granny stitch in the chain 3 space, and you will continue up until you reach your desired size that fits your size. I made a total of 16 rows to fit my desired size, but you can make as much row or as much less rows as you desire. And now we're going to crochet at the top of our work to create a top part with no increases. And I will be changing my color for this. So after I attach my new color, we'll start working at the top of our work. We'll start with a chain 3 and place 2 double crochet into that first stitch there to form our first granny stitch. And then we're just going to be placing granny stitches across the top of our work into all these stitches here, which was the beginning and the last stitch from all our other previous rows. We'll just place granny stitches in each of them across the top of our work. So keep crocheting the granny stitch into all these available spaces across the top of the work until you reach at the end. This right here is actually our very beginner circle that we made at the beginning. We're just gonna keep placing granny stitches in there and all the other stitches across, and keep going until you reach at the end of the row. And you will place your last granny stitch in this chain space right here. This is the first row for the top part, and it's just granny stitches across with no increase, and we're just going to continue placing granny stitches across into each space, back and forth, until we make the top part. Because we are no longer making any granny stitch increase, we will begin the rows with a chain of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and turn your work. And then we'll just make our granny stitches into each of our available spaces across. The granny stitch into each of these spaces until we reach back at the end of the row across. And we'll end the row with a chain 1 and 1 double crochet at the top of our chain 3 space. And you'll just repeat for the other rows, just granny stitches across without any increases. So like for this row, make a chain 3, turn your work, and then because there's a space there, you can put your granny stitch in there. Because the chain 3 is considered as a double crochet, you can make 2 double crochets in the space to make your very first granny stitch. And just continue making your granny stitch across into every space until you reach at the end of that row again, which would also end with a granny stitch in the space. We've now made 3 rows of the top part. I'm going to make a total of 5 rows of the top part, but you can make as many as you like according to how you want your top to fit on you. Consider placing your work on your body so that you will know the desired length you want your top to be. continue making your granny stitches back and forth across with no increase at the top of your work until you have your desired length for the top part. And that is my 5 rows finished. And now you'll just chain 1 and fasten off here. And that is our bandana top here. We will be folding our ends like this to form the back and turn our work to be the front. And now we'll work on our straps. Before we begin on the strap, let's just weave in this end before we go along. For the straps, you will place your work up against your body exactly where you want it to be and mark off where you want your straps to be. Exactly where you want it to be, you will place your stitch marker right there. Begin the straps with a slip knot and attach the yarn to where your stitch marker is. And then you will make a chain of 200. I made a chain of 200 because it was long enough to fit around my shoulders and make the crisscross in the back. You can make even more chains or even less chains if you desire. And then you will slip stitch back down all your chains. And then you will slip stitch in the next stitch of your work and fasten off there. And that is the first strap. You will then go to the other stitch marker and make your other strap by chaining 200 and slip stitching back down. Don't forget to weave in your ends after your straps are finished. And now that the straps are finished, we can now make our crisscross in the back. And that's a wrap. Your very own granny stitch bandana top is ready to rock. If you enjoyed this tutorial, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a stitch. Drop your color combos or questions below. I love chatting with you. Until next time, stay creative and keep those hooks moving.